Welcome to another edition of Noon Bites, an outreach service of the Colorado School for the Deaf and the Blind. I'm Sarah Kennedy. I'm the director of the Colorado Families for Hands and Voices chapter. Like many of you listening, I have a deaf child myself, and I'm happy to share some of our tips about including our child in family traditions and events and holidays. And not just from our family, but from the many families I've talked to over the years, and from the wisdom of deaf and hard of hearing adults who've been generous enough to share their stories with me. So let's begin. So here we've got the peaceful weeks of fall. You've learned how to create a listening environment in your home. If you're using amplification, you've gotten comfortable with that. If you're using sign language, you've immersed yourself in that as much as you can. I know how difficult that can be on the way to Telluride, the picture that you're seeing on the screen. But then come the family holidays, the fall and winter events, all the more noise and people and traditions to understand, new vocabulary. And then we have the time change too. That doesn't help either. So for many of our kids, we need to provide direct instruction in understanding our own family traditions and the customs that we use with birthdays and Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. I think it's helpful to keep in mind as parents what those events look like from our child's perspective. So let's take a look first at our own child. Think about how your child is wired. Every child comes into the world with a distinct personality. Maybe they're really gregarious and outgoing and just thrive on a busy social calendar. Or maybe they're a little bit more like me as a child, who's a little bit more retiring, needed to have personal space, and recharged by spending time alone or reading or walking outside. Not that I didn't love and enjoy people, but you want to mix sometimes. So think about how your child's going to experience this next holiday. It can be difficult when there's a mismatch between parent and child. So if you're the really outgoing one, you might be encouraging your child a bit too strongly to participate in all this chaos of family events when they really want more of a balance, kind of like I did. Or, the opposite is true. If you're a little more quiet and your child wants to be out and about, it can be difficult to find that balance. Some of the things you might consider is planning a little more one-on-one time for a child who's more quiet, or break time so that they have time to recharge. It doesn't have to be 24/7 family involvement. Let's take a look at what else we can do to prepare for the event. So for all of us, adults and kids alike, knowing what to expect at an upcoming event is so important. Think about Halloween. Each Halloween season has its own language, its own weird customs. It's the only time we let our kids go up to strangers and ask for candy, right? This child in the picture might be a little more frightened if she didn't have the adult wearing a costume that kind of lets her see a face and maybe use a little speech reading. So that's an example of a nice accommodation of a change to something that they might not have thought of. Deaf adults have told me that masks and even face paint can really obscure how they read a person's communication. It's not just words that we say or sign, it's all about facial expression, tone, position, and all of that can be obscured when we've got these giant masks on or weird makeup, right? Certainly, a child has the right to decide what's fun for them. So if you have a child who's especially nervous about all this costume stuff, you might decide you want to visit the park that has the daytime event so your other kids maybe can enjoy the more typical Halloween season and keep that child home to give out candy or do something else entirely different. It's a chance to reinvent the holiday to best include our own kids. The scary dark night can be another issue as well. The idea of trying to speech read or use your listening in a dark situation just makes it that much more difficult. So the use of, some cheap flashlights can be a really cool toy, and it can provide greater access. My own daughter still really loves Halloween, but I think she's all about the candy. So she's not working on communicating with people so much as focusing on her goal of getting to as many houses as possible and helping the candy last until, Easter. Let's talk about next understanding who's going to be at the event. So in this day and age, with all the digital photos that, none of us print anymore, they're all on our computers, we can really show our kids who to expect is going to be at any given birthday party or reunion. And we can use some visual aids as well. So I like this family chart on the left here. It not only includes the names and the relationship, but even some of the nicknames. So we know Grandpa is also called Bud. It's hard for our kids to catch the first name, let alone any possible nicknames and what other people call each other. So that's a nice option. You can hop on Facebook ahead of any family event, and if families are involved in that, social media, and give your child a clue about who they might expect to see at the party and a little bit about their stories. And that's good for all of our kids when we expose them to family members they don't see very often, or, friends visiting who will be coming in from out of town. The other picture on the wall is nice too. That's something that could be up year-round and help show the relationships between various members of the family. There are quite a few deaf adults who told me, it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I really realized who was related to who and how, especially if they had a really big family. So that's something that can jumpstart that knowledge. Another idea I have heard is for Thanksgiving, for example, involve all the kids, including your deaf and hard of hearing child, in creating placemats for each person. They'll write the name and maybe a few things they're thankful for that individual, and then it gives them an impromptu seating chart for the family dinner. And I don't know if your family's like mine, I always had to sit at the kid table, so it was a while before I learned who everybody was at the big table. And two, you might ask your child, where do you feel the most comfortable? Sometimes sitting at the kid table with kids who haven't become familiar with hearing loss, don't understand how best to communicate, maybe don't have very good language themselves, isn't the best choice. A child might prefer to sit with the parents or across from the parents. And if you're signing, maybe the parent can sign everything they say at least. And I know my daughter would say half a conversation is better than none. So something to consider with each child. Certainly that wouldn't fit everybody's personality. Let's talk about understanding, after we look at the who, let's talk about the when. So it's important to directly express how long the event is going to be, how long it lasts, when does life return to normal, and the where as well. Where are we going, and why, of course. And we have to teach our kids to ask the why. That's something, it seems like kids with hearing loss don't naturally develop quite as quickly as hearing kids. And yes, you will maybe regret teaching them how to ask why, because those questions will come. Why this, why that? But it's a really important part of their development. So looking at the when, all of us feel more in control of life when we have an idea what to expect next. So if you're outside of your normal routine and you're with family, say we joined our extended family for a weekend at a cabin, so everything's a little bit up for grabs, but we still tried to post a calendar in general, of what a child could expect that day. You know, we're going to do the hike, and then people who want to fish can do that next, or you can come back and hang out and do puzzles or whatever at the cabin, and we'll meet back for dinner at 5:30, or have some idea what the day's going to expect. And then, too, it's really important to share if there's any change in the plans. More than once, we've had a little breakdown at our house because the communication went fast and furious, and we didn't make sure everybody knew, no, we don't have time to do this, we're going to go to the movie instead, or whatever the change is. So make sure you communicate that as much as possible. The map there I bring up because my daughter went with us on a trip to Kansas, and we went to a different town than usual. Her parents live in one city, her grandparents, and we went to a different place. So she was just so upset as a 6-year-old. We're not in Kansas. You told me we were going to Kansas. And it just reminded me that I hadn't explained to her about states and cities and counties and all of that. And traveling is a great time to share through maps, through GPS, through whatever means, where we're traveling and where we're going and where people live in relationship to that. So this picture the family put up where their loved ones actually live all over the country. What a great geography lesson to use really important people in that child's life. And, you know, with a busy, fast-paced family life, that extra support of a visual aid is good for everybody in the family. I can't tell you how many times my hearing kids have missed the information, even though they're sitting right next to you. Do kids really listen to their parents? But that's a question for another time. I know a child who puts up this family calendar for her own family. She's 8, lives on the Western Slope, and she does it every Sunday because she values it so much. It helps her feel organized. So let's talk next about preparing for communication breakdowns. They're going to happen. We might as well have a plan for them, don't you think? So I think it mostly happens for us when there's a mismatch between how we look when we're saying something and the words that we're actually using. For whatever reason, my daughter seems to pay more attention to facial expression and tone of voice, even though she has some good hearing. The actual words said don't register to her as importantly as the whole nonverbal piece. So, for example, her dad and I might be really passionately agreeing about something or discussing a movie we both really enjoyed, and she'll come along and think that we're fighting. So it's important to try to make your face and your tone match your intent. And that is something that, as a hearing parent, I am still learning to do. I just point that out as something, even though my child is 16, how did that happen? That is still happening for us. Certainly the other times communication breakdowns would occur is, as I discussed before, any change in plans, any fast transitions, and then of course we've got the classic complaint of most deaf and hard of hearing adults is that something will happen at a family event or at the dinner table. Everybody explodes in laughter at the story, and nobody can take a moment to explain what happened. I talked to probably 10 people before I got this presentation together, and nobody had a really good solution. But I think probably the most practical is, 1, be aware that that's going to happen, and 2, maybe create a signal with you and your child to help you realize that they're missing out on this information. Take note of it, and maybe you can remember to give them a few highlights or catch back up with them later, because we know realistically, you can't always stop the conversation and explain the old family story of, the dog that got out and Grandpa went running down the street with his pajamas on, or whatever the story is. So have a plan. Maybe your child comes up to you and touches your arm so that you know, I got to remember this to be able to tell them later. Certainly, if you can stop the conversation and share directly, that's so much preferred. As we never want to be in a position like the picture of the train, that's the ASL idiom, train gone sorry. Sorry, we can't stop and explain, the story's over, you missed it. We want to avoid that at all costs, and it's heartbreaking as a parent to have your child miss something, but it's just a reality. I think, too, just checking in with your child at least a little bit every day. How are you doing? Is there anything we could do better? Is there anything you're not understanding? Are you curious about anything? That's just make sure that feedback loop is open. So next, let's think about preparing the family. So if you're going to visit Grandma and Grandpa or Aunt Paula, sometimes it does work really well to send ahead some signing DVDs if your child signs, especially if your kids are young. I don't know any young child that doesn't love watching those or similar DVDs and learning a little bit of sign to make your child feel comfortable. And then once you arrive, there's a more natural feedback loop for people to realize, hey, this really works. She understood that. And not only that, she taught me some new ones. That has been a beautiful thing in our own family, and I know it's worked well for other families. Certainly, none of our families are perfect. That doesn't mean that your child can't still be included. There are certainly cases where none of the extended family learns your child's mode of communication. We have to make the best of it. And sometimes I think for parents that means getting out of your child's way. They are a unique and valuable and fascinating person outside of their hearing loss, and we need to get out of their way so we're not hovering and making it seem like this is the only way you can relate to my child is signing. But give other family members time to create their own bond. Maybe Grandma can't sign because of her arthritis, but maybe she and your child make a tradition of getting up early, walking the dogs, and coming back and making pancakes. Yes, it's not perfect literacy building communication, but it's relationship. And that's important too. I know a family who the grandpa really wanted to relate better with his granddaughter, and they signed, and they lived far away, and he learned what he could, but he also said, I want some time alone with her. I want some time to make a memory. So he got a model that they could build together. She was actually really interested in cars. And they built this model together all that Thanksgiving afternoon. And that's something that girl still cherishes and talks about. So we can make kids feel valuable if we pay attention to them and we let them know we want to know them better. Still, there are some things that you can do, teaching your family about maybe keeping the background noise down so that a child has a chance to use any hearing they might be trying to use. Use visual aids when you're having a family discussion so you can say the person's name or point. Pointing is okay in this situation. Some families really do pass some kind of talking stick or some signal that this is the person who's talking. Because for a lot of our kids, it takes them a while to realize, oh, you're not talking anymore, now it's this person across. Teach your family about closed captioning. Yes, some people will grumble. Sometimes you can't see the sports scores, but it's a small price to pay when a child wants to watch television or a movie with you, to turn those captions on. And I find, and lots of families find, now I can't live without them. So you get used to anything that you are brave enough to try. So preparing the family, do what you can do to teach them about how your child communicates best. Get out of your family's way so that they can develop a relationship of their own. And certainly support sign language if that's the communication mode that your child is using. I think our kids appreciate any attempt. And tell your family that. Don't be nervous if you sign it wrong. I think my daughter knows one sign for each one of us as her family members that she just cherishes because we sign it wrong. But she knows that's the way Mom does it, or that's the way Dad signs it. And it's unique to us. So thank goodness there's room for mercy and a sense of humor in all of this. Let's look at stories from deaf and hard of hearing adults. So we already talked about darkness at Halloween. We could talk about that too with sleepovers. Some families have a huge tradition of sharing sleepovers. Aunt Sally takes all the kids one night and they do a big kid event. Well, again, the big thing about sleepovers is you get to stay up late in the dark. And it's not a communication opportunity for some of our kids. So again, maybe the little gift of some flashlights and teaching kids, point it to yourself when you're talking, can make a huge difference. And it's a get-to. It's a cool thing. Some other folks told me about family pictures, and that's why I have this picture of integrated reading project, early years family up. This was totally new to me. Some adults I talked to said, in our family pictures, I was always the kid looking the wrong way, a different way than everybody else, because I didn't know when they were going to take the picture, who to look at, especially if there was more than one. There was just too much noise going on. So you can see, of course, she's adorable, but everyone's kind of looking one way, except for the child, the centerpiece of the picture. So it's just a little extra thing to have someone do a count, 1, 2, 3, we're going to take the picture, or make sure you get the attention of everybody at the camera. Just a little thing. Again, folks told me it's important to give permission to recharge at these events. It's exhausting if they're using listening in a noisy environment, and they just might need some time alone or a quiet activity. So think about how preschools set up centers. There's the circle center and everybody's gathering, and then there's all these other activities going on. Well, you can use that idea at home for a Thanksgiving. The big football game's on, but maybe in the other room there's a puzzle, or there's a kids' movie, or books, or coloring, and kids can have a little more quiet time or one-on-one conversation at that time. So think about that center idea. We already talked a little bit about the kids' table, and the adults that I talked to did indeed say that was really a bad idea because we couldn't understand our cousins. It would have been better if I'd sat next to my mom for a while, so let your kid be the lead, how that works. Again, making room for that one-on-one conversation is how your extended family and friends are going to learn to communicate with your child. I do have to put in a plug for spending some money once in a while. I have used an interpreter at a family funeral and at a wedding, and I've been to birthday parties where other families have purchased interpreting services, and you can't compare how wonderful that was for those moms, and me included, not to be the interpreter at the event, to actually get to watch your own child communicate at a very deep level with other people they may have not had access to, or to hear stories. We all know what funerals are about. You hear the stories of the person's life, and that's why I didn't want our daughter to miss it. So it was a beautiful thing to have that person there. And I have to say there was the added benefit of our extended family realizing, wow, I can have such a better communication with this child with an interpreter than we've quite gotten to before, especially in a group setting. You know, one-on-one, she could do great. But they learned things about Maddie, and Maddie learned things about them. And I know that's been the case for other families who have used an interpreter. So something to consider. Obviously, we can't do that for every birthday party, but sometimes it's a great choice. I wanted to share, too, about funerals. You know, that's not a planned family event ever. But it, too, has its own language, its own tradition, expectations of behavior. Think of all the strange language you don't use at other times. You know, coffin, casket, pallbearer. Those are all brand new to almost every child, not just our kids with hearing loss. So a deaf teacher had told me that when he was young, his grandpa had died, and he's standing in line with his mom and the family, and you know how it's sort of a receiving line, and people go through and say, if there's anything I can do for you, just let me know. And after about the 10th person to say that, the little boy, who's now a teacher, said, well, you could come over and vacuum. And I thought, what a perfect example of how a child might need to have a little more direct instruction about how this works. You know, what's the expected thing to say back? And hopefully someone did come over and vacuum. That's what I think. So next, I think the main thing, I love this movie, The Help. So here Abilene is checking in with her charge. You know, they practically raised these kids in the South. And she was saying, you are kind, you are smart, you are important. She had that connection with that little girl every day. And I think that's so important to remember, to regularly check in with our kids. Ask them, is there anything you're worried about? Is there anything we could do better here? They have so much wisdom in them if we just give them a little chance to express it. And I think if you regularly ask, then they'll be thinking, what could I say when she asks me again? So such an important thing to talk about. I think, finally, when I talked about this presentation with other families, some of them said, well, isn't that just good parenting? But if you review all the things we've talked about, I just think there's a little bit more to it when we are raising kids who are deaf or hard of hearing. They have their own culture. We want them to be part of our culture. There's so much to think about. There's so many ways we can improve their experience. So all of these things I would encourage you to think about. You know, looking at how your child's wired, pre-teaching, just like you learned about the teachers in school do, and then going back and reteaching in case there were any holes. Vocabulary, using visual tools, involving your own child in the plans for the holiday. You know, maybe they would really get excited about putting out invitations or doing some baking ahead of time. And that just gives you a chance to explain that much more in a really natural way. And then always, you know, talking to other families is great, but I can't tell you how much I have learned from the generosity of deaf and hard of hearing adults who shared with me along the way. So, again, I'm Sarah Kennedy. I'm from Colorado Families for Hands and Voices. We welcome you to join this conversation and others on our Facebook site. And I know the Colorado School for the Deaf and the Blind also has a Facebook page. Thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing from you.